Hello, my name is Lucas Anderson, and today I will be presenting on Deborah Sampson, also known as Robert Shirtliff. Deborah was born in Plimpton, Massachusetts, as the fifth of seven children to Jonathan and Deborah Sampson. Not much is known about Deborah Sampson's early life, or family life for that matter, other than the fact that they were not extremely poor, but they were definitely on the lower end of living standards. Um, Jonathan himself abandoned the family or died at sea. It is still debated and unclear. Some historians believe that he joined up with a sea crew and was lost at sea. Others say that he actually abandoned his family and disappeared. There is a different Jonathan Sampson that shows up around this time, about, I want to say 30 miles to the north. And it's not clear if it's the same one, but ended up having another wife and a couple kids with that person, and also was accused of murdering 5 people. We don't know if exactly that is the same Jonathan as the connection to our Deborah, but that happened in 1765. The 1770s, there's kind of like a weird gap as far as her life when talking. She gets moved around through a lot of different households and different families as various kind of situations keep showing up. The 7 children eventually get all split up into different families. Deborah herself ends up moving in with a Jeremiah and Susanna in Middleborough, about 5 miles to the southwest of Plimpton. She was the oldest of 5 boys. The main house that she was born in, the ancestral home, doesn't exist anymore. It's been kind of demolished and rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt. It is still memorialized to this day. This house, however, is the one that she lived in through most of her teenage life, and it does still stand, although it's been heavily refurbished. In this position, and with these, specifically with Jeremiah and Susanna, she was considered an indentured servant, and was basically living under their house as an indentured servant. This is the part of her life that we start to find out a lot more about. Mainly, the thing we know is that the one thing that all scholars can kind of agree about this point in Sampson's life is that she was a farm girl at this point. She was working heavily on the farm. She was extremely physically active. All of the clothes, they were also another poor family, and which is why they kind of got Sampson in as a indentured servant through events rather than through actual payment or buying. But they were a fairly poor farming family. They immediately put Sampson to work, and Sampson continued to work until Sampson reached the age of 18. There was a lot of farm work. There was a lot of heavy labor. There was also not a lot of women's clothing at this time in this area. Sampson actually talked a lot about in the biography written by Herman Mann about how everyone just wore male clothing. That was just what was available, and that kind of got passed down. There was no stigma about it like in other parts of Puritan societies. It was just practical living. This is also the time when Sampson gained firearm knowledge and usage of firearms. It's not exactly clear what or how, and Jeremiah was also kind of he's very Puritan in his beliefs, in the idea of, he wasn't a Puritan himself, but he's very puritanical in his beliefs that women should not be educated and should not have any kind of formal education or knowledge. But he was very insistent on Sampson learning firearms in order to protect the family in case something happened. Sampson also at this time was literate, and we don't think that this came from the Jeremiah and Susanna household, Thomas household, because of their puritanical views. In 1778, Sampson actually left the household when her indentured servitude came up when she turned 18, and worked as a little bit as both a weaver and a teacher. This part also confuses historians a little bit because we don't know where Sampson got the ability and knowledge to actually perform weaving. The teaching, we kind of guess that the teaching came from two places of, like literacy, came from two places. The first was, we believe that Sampson actually did learn something from her father before he left when she turned 5 or 6-ish. And the other is that she improved those skills of reading when she was living in the extremely religious Thomas household. There's another theory that she was taught by her mother or grandmother in between these two times, but it's not as clear, and there's no other evidence of the other Sampson kids being very literate at this point either. So it's kind of our best guess as to one of these two places. Sampson was actually fairly successful as a teacher. We don't know much about Sampson as a teacher other than successfully completed one semester and was actually called back for a second semester. At this time, Sampson was around 18-ish and was looking at possibly being married off at this point. Sampson was really opposed to that idea and so actually ran away, taking on the name Timothy Thayer, and in April 1782 in Middleborough actually tried to register for the Continental Army and join up with the military. Sampson was then caught and was basically going to be punished, but decided to run away instead. And then on May 20th in 1782, Robert Shirtliff ended up joining up with the Continental Army. So this was actually Sampson's second attempt at actually trying to join the Continental Army. It's not clear what exactly the rest of the people in Sampson's life were thinking during Sampson's time in the army. There's a lot of ideas of like, she disappeared, she deserted, she's just gone. Maybe she died, maybe she ran away to the west, you know what I mean? So, but Sampson joined the military under the name Robert Shirtliff. Now, Sampson was able to do this for a couple different reasons. First of all, Sampson was extremely strong from their time on the farm. They were extremely muscular, not anything out of the ordinary, but especially like muscular for a woman at the time. Sampson was also extremely tall, far above the average height. Average height in this time for enlistment would have been around 5'5". Sampson's height is actually 5'7". The other thing that caused there to be a little less questioning of Sampson is the uniforms at this time were especially built to try and bulk up a lot of the prepubescent boys to make them look more masculine and more militaristic. So all these kind of events kind of culminated into Sampson's ability to disguise themselves and actually go into the military. Sampson ended up being stationed at West Point for a lot of the training. The training at West Point, it was pre it being an actual training facility. Instead, it was more of just a militaristic camp. The other thing that a lot of people misunderstand about Sampson and the story is a lot of people say that Sampson actually fought in the Revolutionary War. That is not exactly true. Sampson fought in a weird time that took place at the end of the war, known as the War of the Hudson Valley. This was a time where Britain had already surrendered, the war was over, but British troops had not yet evacuated. They were still hunkered down, they were still causing issues. They were pretty much like, well, maybe the new continental country will fail and we'll just swoop back in. So Robert Shirtliff, also Deborah Sampson, was stationed in West Point at this time. After 6 months of training, Sampson would be sent into combat. So it was also a significantly less amount of training than we're used to today. Sampson also had the unique opportunity of being stationed in a light infantry. So the light infantry at this time wore a lot less equipment and were more agile, and they also were typically of taller stature. these were not soldiers who were rank and file. They instead would go on scouting missions. They would go on ambush missions. They were known as an aggressive group rather than a organized group. And like I said, after a month of that training and drills is when Sampson actually ended up in combat. Sampson was injured in a set of skirmishes at this time during the War of the Hudson Valley. It's not exactly clear where or how Sampson was injured, but what we do know from Sampson's records is that Sampson actually was injured across the head with what we believe was a sword or cutlass, and shot somewhere in the leg or hip with a musket ball. Sampson hid the injury on her hip or thigh, but was treated for the head wound. During the time of Sampson's medical, during the time of her medical recovery, Sampson actually stole some medical equipment in order to remove the musket ball herself. She described in one interview of using a pair of tongs and needles. Later, Sampson actually mentioned that it was a silver probe with a hook at the end, a needle, lint, and some extra salve that the doctors were actually using to treat her head. Now, this is another weird part of Sampson's life that kind of gets twisted in the histories, because we're not exactly sure after this recovery what goes on. We know that Sampson was going around more in the kind of like general area of New York and that kind of a thing, but we don't know exactly where, what battles. We know that Sampson was injured again in Tarrytown, but again, we don't know the exact details of that injury. From what we gather later on in Sampson's life, that injury in Tarrytown is actually another musket ball shot, but due to her not operating on her leg the correct way and removing the musket ball the correct way, she instead decides to hide this one and just accept that she has a musket ball. We also know that from Sampson's description of it, Sampson describes it as being a dislocating shot. This means that we know it was some kind of joint, so our guess again is either hip or shoulder, but again, we have no actual details of this. After those injuries and the confrontations at Tarrytown, fever strikes, and Sampson is again taken into medical care and nursed back to health. This is a very interesting time in Sampson's career, and especially in Sampson's time as living as Robert Shirtliff, because it is during this time, when recovering from fever, that Sampson begins to draw a lot of attention from a lot of the female servants serving around where Sampson was recovering. Sampson especially takes a liking to one indentured servant in particular, so far as to beginning a romantic courtship with this person. It's not ever clear from our historical records if anyone ever found out Robert Shirtliff was actually Deborah Sampson, or if they were simply, because all the accounts that we get from these indentured servants that had flings for Sampson and all that kind of things were romanticizing the idea of the big, strong hero Robert Shirtliff. The one indentured servant that Sampson actually showed returning affection to is very complicated. Obviously, Sampson's very open about this time of her life, and continually saying in the military that she was able to keep her chastity. It's something that's very important to Sampson, and something that Sampson constantly brings up across through the entirety of her life, is that she is, during her entire time in the military, she was chaste, and that was never something that was an issue for her. It would have been an issue for other people at this time. It was very widely known that a lot of prostitutes would dress up as soldiers in order to sneak into camps and then sneak out of camps. But Sampson was wanting to be very clear that the reason that she was dressing up was not for sexual or courtship reasons. which makes this courtship with this indentured servant even more interesting. It is also one of the times that a lot of historians like to question what Samson's actual sexuality is. It's very clear that Samson was showing romantic feelings. Now, whether Samson actually had these romantic feelings is up for debate, but it is very clear that Samson was actually returning a lot of these romantic courtships that the servant was passing to her. Samson also, at this time, was suspected of, well, we think at this time that the doctor who was treating Samson for fever actually did discover that Robert Shirtliff was Deborah Sampson, and that discovered Robert Shirtliff was a woman in disguise. But we're not exactly sure what happens after. What we know, though, is that Deborah Sampson and Robert Shirtliff is able to recover from this fever and leave without any kind of an issue. In 1783, gets signed as a waiter for I forget if it was a general or a colonel in the Continental Army. Basically is taken out of the line of combat and is instead put into a line of more like prestigious, or like, I want to say servitude, but servitude isn't the right one because it came with like a certain level of honor and prestige. It was also a more upper end commander or general. So there was a lot of honor with it, and there was a lot of importance with it. It also allowed Samson to kind of brush shoulders with a lot of important people at this time. It is at this time that that Samson is actually discovered. Before I move on, this is actually I wanted to bring this up because this is actually a watercolor print of Samson dressed as Robert Shirtliff. This is actually hanging in the West Point Museum. West Point Academy and Museum actually has a lot of pride towards Deborah Sampson because Samson is a very patriotic figure and has become known as a very patriotic person. A lot of historians bring up the question of why did Deborah Sampson dress up as a revolutionary soldier, and a lot of historians claim that is purely for patriotic and revolutionary reasons. West Point itself takes a lot of pride in Samson and has had this watercolor hanging in there for, I believe it was put up in 1840 or 1850. And the reason I like this watercolor so much is because it is the only image we have of Deborah Sampson where she actually appears happy and is smiling. Every other painting and every other image I have seen during my research has Samson showing this big, strong, serious face, except for this one, which is also the number one image that the military uses to discuss it. But, as I saw in the last slide, in October 23rd, or no, it wasn't October 23rd, that was when she was dispatched. In the beginning of, I believe it was August of 1783, Samson is actually discovered. It then takes a few months before the discharge paperwork actually comes through, but Samson is discharged in October of 1783. It's not clear what happens with Samson after the discharge for a little bit. We know that Samson is engaged in October 1784 and married a man named Benjamin Garnett in April 1785. This is also another very interesting time in Samson's life when it talks about discussions of sexuality and Samson's actual identification, because Samson has a lot of freedom as a woman, as an unmarried woman at this time, much more than the Puritan times before the Revolution. And so there's a lot of question as to why Samson actually marries this man. There's also another little interesting wrinkle into the mess where Samson is pregnant and announces pregnancy 2 months before they're actually married. So the question is did they get engaged and then Deborah and him have get pregnant out of wedlock? Or is there something else going on? It's a weird situation, and a lot of historians like to debate this as well. As far as Benjamin Garnett's kind of deal, we don't know much about him actually before he meets with Deborah. Um, we know that he was a farmer and a laborer. We know that he was extremely poor. And we also know that he had absolutely no military or political experience or anything of any kind before meeting up with Sampson. He is just simply a poor farmer laborer. It's another thing that a lot of historians like to really question is, why did Deborah marry this man? What was it about Benjamin Garnett that drew this Revolutionary War hero to him? We don't know. But we do know that Deborah and him had 3 children in the first 6 years of their marriage. They ended up adopting another, I believe it was 7 or 8 years after they get married, but they also stopped having children. This is also extremely weird for this time period. It was very common of people in Deborah's age group to be having 6 or 7 children before stopping. But Deborah only had 3 and adopted 1 more. Deborah began petitioning for basically held salary in 1790. Deborah was awarded back pay in 1792. It was at this time that Deborah got in contact with a man named Herman Mann. Herman Mann is a firm believer in the Republican lifestyle. He was a very staunch intellectual. He was very, very purposeful and forceful with how he wrote and how he talked. He ended up getting together with Deborah and them actually working on her petitions in order to get that back pay, and that is how they got connected. He agreed to help her write a book, and they completed that book in 1972 as well. That book is an extremely interesting primary source because it is Deborah giving her side of the story, but Mann interjecting with nearly every part of it. Mann takes every opportunity possible to throw in his own ideas, his own agendas, his own politics, his own beliefs. Nearly everything in that book that is Deborah is actually being filtered through Mann. And it's an extremely frustrating source, and it's very clear a lot of historians hate that source. One historian even says that they begrudgingly had to include it in their research. But it is our real only big primary source. And there is a couple parts of that source where Deborah's voice actually comes through pretty well. And those are the parts that Henry Mann doesn't quite understand. Particularly this courtship with the indentured servant during Deborah's recovery from the fever. Herman Mann is completely baffled by this. He has no idea how to interpret this. He tries to write it as a courtship between Robert and this servant rather than Sampson and this servant. And it is very clear he has no idea what the deal is with it, but he is including it in the book anyway. Sampson also at this point mentions how desperately wishes could go back and find the indentured servant, and that they actually had plans to get back together and try and see what they could create together or start a life together if Deborah wasn't caught. Because Deborah was caught, Deborah says that she feels a lot of guilt and nervousness about what this servant would think of her, and actually is afraid to contact her again. This is the actual portrait and cover of the book that Deborah and Herman Mann created. It was also at this time that Herman Mann decided that the best thing for Deborah Sampson to do once the book was finished is to begin traveling and performing. Herman Mann basically wrote scripts for Deborah to go up on stage and recite. These scripts are almost humiliating. They're very filled with apologetic, very Deborah things to be saying. It is very clear that it is Herman Mann speaking through Deborah, and him using it as a platform to try and push for that Republican lifestyle. Deborah still goes along with these because her husband doesn't have money. She doesn't have money. They have kids. Deborah also at this time is really afraid of being forgotten. One thing that Deborah constantly talks about in her old age is that she doesn't want glory, but she doesn't want to be forgotten. During these traveling and performing of shows, Deborah decides to petition to Congress for pension. This is in 1805. Now, we don't know exactly what these petitions look like. They've been lost in the congressional records. But one thing that is noted from multiple witness accounts of these proceedings is that one thing that they wanted to talk about was Sampson had to show proof for pension that she actually was involved in fighting, which also showed off, which also included her showing off a bunch of her scars that she got during the continental fighting, colonial fighting. It's not exactly clear what is meant by this, but Sampson also, this is the point where Sampson also mentions about the musket ball that was never removed. The whole reason for these kind of congressional things was because Sampson was specifically going for invalid pension. And so Sampson had to prove that the injuries that she sustained during the war were unable to keep her from living a normal life and being able to actually contribute. It would be the equivalent to like our disability today. It takes a while, but eventually I believe it's like 2 or 3 years later, Sampson actually does get awarded that pension. This marks a very almost sad but interesting time in Sampson's life because she disappears from the historical record. In 1813, her and her husband are able to purchase a house for the first time. It is a very small house. They're very poor at this time. They are not able to live the life that Sampson wanted. Sampson also cuts off Herman Mann at this point. His stories are becoming so in just bloated, and he's adding more and more information as time goes on. His stories to this point now, he's talking about Sampson joining up with the colonial armies and marching west to fight off the Indians and having grand adventures against the Indians and Native Americans and fighting the savages, when Deborah never did. Deborah was fairly short-term in the military for almost 14 months and had no connection to anything west. But Herman Mann just kept exploding these stories more and more, so Sampson eventually cut him off. This is the time when Sampson's life gets quite sad. We don't know much about it, but from what we do know of her old age, Sampson became even more worried about being remembered. Again, not looking for glory, but just simply acknowledgement and just wanting to be remembered. Deborah passed away on April 29th, 1827. The family was too poor to afford a gravestone, and so they placed her in an unmarked grave. This is extremely notable because Sampson's son even worked as a stone cutter at this time, but was unable to afford a stone for his own mother's grave. It wasn't until her husband, Benjamin Gamut, died that they were able to actually get a headstone. Deborah's headstone reads, Deborah Gamut, wife of Benjamin Gamut. It does not mention her service. It does not mention anything about her. She is only known as his wife. We don't know exactly when. This grave was put in 1850. Now, we don't know exactly when, but a different stonecutter came in about 10, 20 years later and wrote on the back, Deborah Sampson, Robert Shirtliff, and the incorrect dates of her service. It is the ultimate just, it's so depressing and sad. It took a long time for people to actually pay attention to Deborah Sampson. And during the 1970s, especially with the women's movement and women's liberation movement, we were able to get a lot more conversation going. Some places still had small-scale representation of Deborah. This is a fire department badge that actually memorializes Deborah. They also have a statue in Mount Vernon, and there are several different memorials that have been placed through Deborah's life. There are some at her childhood home that we saw. There are some at her birth home that we saw. So there have been a lot more recent memorializations happening and a lot more push to be like, well, who was this person? Who was Deborah Sampson? Who was Robert Shirtliff? And also a lot of topic nowadays has been discussing with, well, do we need to be discussing Deborah Sampson as a trans individual? Do we need to be looking at Deborah Sampson and being like, this is a person who wanted to be Robert Shirtliff, but wasn't able to at the time? Other historians are like, no, she is the American Mulan. She was the perfect emblem of a woman patriot fighter and should be the face of feminine history and should be the ultimate in patriotism and what every American woman should aspire to. We don't know, and honestly, we probably never will. But what we do know is that Deborah Sampson is an incredible individual that has unfortunately been misrepresented by nearly everyone who discusses her, including probably me. But should we stop discussing her? I don't think Deborah would want us to stop talking